Hey now, today I'm brewing just a nice, easy drinking American wheat beer. You can check out the recipe video on the channel if you want. But today what I'm going to be doing is conducting, as I usually do, a forced attenuation test. Now, this is one of the best ways to help troubleshoot a problem beer. If you are going through a fermentation and it winds up sort of stalling out and you're trying to figure out exactly what went wrong, this is a good way to figure out if it was a recipe formulation with the grist, if it was some problem with the mash, or perhaps it was a problem with the actual fermentation itself. Now, what we do with these forced attenuation tests is post-boil, and I'm not there yet, you collect a small quantity of wort. You basically conduct a rapid, small volume fermentation of it to figure out what it can actually attenuate to or how far it can ferment down under sort of ideal situations. So it's involving an overpitch of yeast. We're just using bread yeast for that. And fermenting a little bit warmer than you typically would, seeing how far that goes, and then with your large batch of beer, if you don't get anywhere near that, then you know that you have a problem with the yeast that you've added to it or the fermentation. However, if you do wind up with sort of a higher than expected gravity with the forced attenuation test, and that's where you wind up with your actual fermentation, then you know it was on the grist and mash side of the brewing process and something went awry there. So this is just a really good way to troubleshoot what's going on. So let me show you exactly how I like to do this. So my boil is done, I've whirlpooled, I'm running off through my plate chiller into my carboys. So now I've also gone ahead and prepared the vessel that I'm going to be doing my forced attenuation test in. I do have Erlenmeyer flasks that I use for this particular task. However, you could easily use mason jars or anything else like that. I like these 500 ml Erlenmeyer flasks. I've just sanitized them with Star San sanitizer. Also, the aluminum foil here up on the top has also been sanitized and it's ready to go. This is a good size vessel because I'm wanting 300 mils or sort of that like cup and a quarter-ish amount of liquid for this operation. When I go to collect, I am going to collect 400 mils. So with my brewery setup here, I do like to collect this after I have filled all the carboys that I'm working with here. Forced attenuation tests can work for any brew setup that you've got, whether you're doing like a cooler mash tun setup, if you've got brew in a bag, if you've got some sort of fancy electric system or anything like that. The point here is that we want to be able to collect wort in a manner that is sanitary and it's not going to mess up any of the wort that's actually going to be fermented for consumption, and ideally also to collect it in a way that's sanitary so that we're not messing up what's going into our small vessel. Okay, so now that I have filled both of these carboys here, I am ready to fill up my Erlenmeyer flask. So I'm just going to steal this hose out of here. I'm just going to tuck it into my flask, let the wort flow back in. And then, like I said, I'm collecting 400 mils just so that I'm also able to do a gravity test, but I only need 300 or so for the actual forced attenuation. And I'm going to take this down to the brewery. So, as I said, the first task here is just to capture what I need for my gravity reading for this beer, because that's always important. I'm just going to take care of that in a minute. And then, for the forced attenuation test, you can just use any sort of bread yeast. You can use the sort of the traditional larger bits of yeast. You can use the instant yeast like I am right now. And roughly, I go with a teaspoon. Just add it like that. And there we are. And then you want to get it someplace warm. You could put it just in your kitchen up on top of your refrigerator, cover it up. You could put it any place that's warm. I'm going to use my yeast incubator here for it, just because that's sort of a dedicated space for this. And it'll probably take a couple of days for this to ferment out. And for the record, reading below the meniscus on this, our original gravity is 1.040. So I have both my carboys aerated here, and I'm just ready to pitch these yeasts. Just for the record, I'm going with two different yeasts that I have rehydrated here. I've got USO5 and SO4, and I'm going to be putting them into the carboys here respectively, left and right. And we'll just add them to the carboys. And here we are, all ready to ferment. After 2 days here, we can see that this forced attenuation test is fully fermented. The yeast is flocculated out. I'm just going to toss this into the fridge so it can cool down and we can get a hydrometer reading. So the beer here is at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the temperature that I run my hydrometer at. And reading below the meniscus, this comes in at 1.010. So at that 1010, that's our first attenuation test. So we'll see how close the actual beer gets. And now I have my thief all nicely sanitized. I'm just going to go to what I believe is a fully fermented wheat beer here. Steal some of that. I've also sanitized the interior of this graduated cylinder here, because right away I'm going to go ahead and thieve a sample from the second carboy here as well, just because it had a different yeast strain and I want to test them both. And so reading below the meniscus, we're just going to pop this into here. This is on that SO4 yeast. Let's settle out, and we're also coming in at 1010 for it. And with our USO5, let's get this hydrometer into there. Oh, and this one reading below the meniscus also comes in at 1010. So both of these beers match the forced attenuation. So that was a successful forced attenuation test. Worked really great for both of those strains. Both the USO5 as well as the SO4 matched up perfectly with that. Now there are some times where I use a higher attenuating yeast or a much lower attenuating yeast and it doesn't quite match up with the forced attenuation test. However, it is a really good way to just double check. If you have a situation where you get a gravity reading and it is significantly higher than the forced attenuation test, then you know that you have some sort of a fermentation issue, perhaps with the yeast, or maybe a stalled fermentation, something like that going on, and you can try to rectify it. However, if your forced attenuation test is very high, then you know that you have a wort composition issue and something happened during the mash or something like that. But it's just one of those ways that you can narrow down potential issues. In an ideal world, your beer will always ferment down to right around where that forced attenuation test is, and it will sort of be unnecessary, but at least you are sort of hedging your bets in case there's an issue later on. Anyway, there you go, just a little tool you can add to your brewing tool belt in case you have any kind of an issue down the line, or even just to give yourself a little bit of peace of mind. So until next time, keep your brews at 11.